For those of you who are really into gardening, most of you probably have already likely started your starter seeds. They're already growing. You already have your little greenhouse, your little lamps, got it all going. And fairly soon we will also have farmers planting oats, planting corn, and then other gardeners, they'll catch up and will plant their gardens. Whether or not you've ever planted a seed in your life or not, some of you have no desire, no interest, probably don't even know what seeds look like. But all of us know that the farmer and the gardener anticipate getting the exact produce of what they planted. You don't have to be a gardener to know that. The farmer plants oats and corn. The gardener plans to harvest his or her tomatoes, the peas, the green beans, the sweet corns, the cucumbers. And if you're me, you expect to harvest weeds. The reason that we anticipate the produce is because we all believe in this truth. And that is what? You reap what you sow. So whether in gardening or farming or in life, we preach this truth. What? You will reap what you what? Sow. When Cain killed his brother, Abel, which is recorded for us in Genesis chapter 4, God punishes Cain. And so we would say, what? He reaped what he sowed. He killed his brother. God punishes Cain. Hey, that's what Cain did. There's a consequence. When Lamech, later in Genesis 4 as well, kills someone because they struck him, he brags about it to his wives. He had more than one. And basically he's saying, you know what? Hey, if I struck them, God was going to protect Cain as well, put a boundary and say, you know what? If God will do that for Cain, he'll do that for me. Well, there's no sense of any consequence that we see in Genesis chapter 4. In fact, Lamech is kind of bragging about it. So in one sense that we would say he didn't reap what he sowed, and we would call that injustice because he didn't receive a punishment for his actions. When David kills Goliath in 1 Kings chapter 17, we would agree that with what's recorded in the scriptures, and that Goliath got exactly what he deserved. For him to mock God, to ridicule God, to spout hatred towards God, the fact that God sent David to put a stone in Goliath's head and he falls face plants on the ground and then he cuts off his head, we would say what? Goliath got what he deserved. He reaped as a result of his sowing. God took his life because of his mockery towards God. So we would say, you know what? I'm all in this on you reap what you sow. But what about the situations in life when that principle and truth do not seem to be true? In 1 Samuel chapter 1, the Bible records for us about a man by the name of Elkanah. He also, in this situation, had two wives, Peninnah and Hannah. And this was a time where the worship happened at the tabernacle. And once each year, there was a yearly sacrifice. They would go to offer the yearly sacrifice. So Elkanah would go along with his two wives. Peninnah had children and Hannah didn't. And being the loving person that she was, Peninnah said, hey, I feel so sorry for you, Hannah. I'm sorry you can't have children. Now, if you're familiar with the biblical account, you know that is exactly what did not happen. Through no choice of her own, Hannah could not have children, and Peninnah used every year in which they would go up to the sacrifice that she would harass Hannah and say, well, look who doesn't have any children this year going up to the yearly sacrifice. It says that her adversary, Hannah's adversary, which is Peninnah, provoked her sore to make her fret because the Lord had shut up her womb. And then it says this, and each year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah provoked Hannah so much so that she wept and did not eat. Now let me ask you this question. What did Hannah do to deserve that? It was nothing that she was in control of. She was just not allowed to have children. We knew it wasn't because of the husband, because he had two wives. One wife is having children, the other one doesn't. So we know it's not the issue with the husband. So Peninnah lets Hannah know, hey, you can't have kids. And she did it so much that Hannah would weep, and so much so that she did not eat. Later, in 1 Samuel chapter 18, Saul is king, and he's having some bad days, and so they say to the consultation was, let's find somebody that can play you some music. And as they did some searching through the country, they find David. David is good on the harp, good on the instruments. And they said, all right, David, when Saul's having a bad day, we need you to come and play music. So David does just that in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And it says, well, David was playing the music to soothe Saul. An evil spirit came upon Saul, so much so that he hurled his spear at David, attempting to kill him. So it would make sense for us to ask the question, what did David do to deserve that? He was summoned to play for the king. The king has this evil spirit upon him. He's distressed. He's disturbed. Whatever it is, we don't know exactly. But he's having a horrible, very terrible, bad day. And then the music, he's jealous of David. There's some events that happen. He's jealous of David, and he hurls that spear at him. And we can look at it and say, what did David do to deserve that? Those are just two of many examples in the Bible where the principle, you reap what you sow, doesn't add up. In other words, there's not a correlating bad action that results, or behavior or decision that would explain the hardship that one is experiencing. We can't answer it. I can't tell you why that happened. It doesn't seem that you deserved it. We read just moments ago in Job chapter 1. I invite you to turn to chapter 2 for just a moment. In Job chapter 2. In Job chapter 1, Job had a very bad day. And I don't mean that lightly. He had a very bad, horrific, catastrophic, terrible day. And ones that you and I would never wish, I would hope, upon anyone. Well, if the bad day could get worse, it did. Because chapter 2 says, and there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Chapter 2 and verse 1, Satan came among them to present before the Lord. The Lord asks him the same question, have you considered my servant Job? And then Satan says in verse 4, and Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man hath will give for his life. But put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. Verse 7, Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took a potsherd. He took a piece of broken pottery. And he would use that. Look at that. It says he would use that to scrape himself withal. In other words, he had oozing wounds. And so he would take that to get the oozing off. So not only did he lose everything in chapter 1, he's now miserably, physically miserable. He has these wounds and the sores, not just one, all over his body. A later description says that his body was like black. So he had so many wounds and so many sores, and apparently from the healing and all of that and the scabbing, that it basically describes him as being black. Look at verse 9. His wife said to him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and what? Die. But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips? But you know, we can relate very much with Job's wife. She's asking the question, God, what did my husband do to deserve this? She's got questions. And she's like, Job, enough is enough. Let's just throw the towel in and say, God, we're done. You haven't treated me fair, and just die. We would probably find ourselves asking the same question if we were in her shoes. But let me submit to us this morning, how many times do we maybe find ourselves asking that same question? What did I do to deserve this? And you're thinking, oh, no, I don't ask that. So maybe you're one of those OCD, put it in a broad category. So if you claim to be OCD, how do you respond when traffic totally destroys your well-organized schedule, or when the kids get home, or the dog comes in the door and traipses in mud and wet, knocks over the lamp, knocks over the plant, they leave their empty snack plates on the living room floor? You may not think the literal thought, but you are wondering what? What did I do to deserve this? Or maybe you spent your entire life working hard, saving up money, planning for retirement and travel, and upon retirement, you're struck with the physical ailment. So rather than travel, you are stuck at home. And your hard-earned money is going towards medical bills and paying others to help you and assist you with each day. You may not form this question specifically in this way in your mind, but you can find yourself actually saying, what did I do to deserve this? This is not what I lived for. I worked hard all my life. And Arnold, I'm not saying this because you're retiring next week. It has nothing to do with you. But then you hear of people, what? That they retired and with what? Just a month or a year, they're dead. And people could say, that wasn't worth it. So we can find ourselves asking this question. What did I do to deserve this? Parents can ask that question as they raise their children and they see them go down a different path than what they raised them to. And they said, what did I do to deserve this? The principle you reap what you sow is a true statement. There are corresponding results or consequences that are tied to an action. But that is not the answer for everything in life. Sometimes things happen, and often do, when no particular action of any kind can be pegged to the real situation in life. We are unable then at that moment to apply this you reap what you sow principle. So then what? How can the life of Job help us with what did I do to deserve this? How can Job help us answer the question, where is God when life hurts? Or what did I do to deserve this? Now, if we want to be very blunt in a theological statement, we can say this. Romans 3 says, there is none righteous, there is none that doeth good, no, not one. And so we could say this in a blunt theological statement, nobody deserves anything good. Now I get the theological statement. That's the foundation of it. We are sinners. We have blown it, and we deserve nothing good. That's just being blunt and putting it at the foundation theological level of it. So it's true in one sense. But on the other hand, we have a wise, a loving, a kind, gracious, and merciful God who gives us good things. And we have been the recipients of that, have we not? So, can we not anticipate good things in life? Yes, and we typically, normally do. When you woke up this morning, did you expect to have, so to speak, a good day? As you're thinking through the rest of the day, what are you planning? What are you thinking? How life can go miserable and just, I hope everything just falls apart. I hope everything just breaks. No, we go through the day anticipating. You all have plans of some kind. Maybe it's taking a nap. Maybe it's doing other things. Maybe it's interacting with others. Maybe it's going enjoying God's creation because the sun's out and maybe not quite as warm, but hey, we're just going to go out there and enjoy God's creation. So we anticipate good. Why? Because we have a good God. So because of that, we do plan for having a good day. So when hard situations unfold in life, we tend to find ourselves asking, where is that good, kind, loving, and merciful God? Has he changed? What's happening? What did I do to deserve this? It happened to Job. So what can we learn from Job? Let's turn to the back of Job, most of the way to the back to Job chapter 29. Job chapter 29. Job does ask questions. He does. Job chapter 29. And it says, moreover, verse 1, Job continued his parable and said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, and the Almighty was with me, when my children were with me. When I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. When I went out through the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, the young men saw me, and because of who he was, they hid themselves." This is before this happened. "The aged would rise up and stood up. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouth. The nobles held their peace, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. Because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had done him, and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy." What is Job saying in those verses? Job is saying, I'm going to have a conversation with God. First of all, life was good, as he explains in the first few verses. But then in verse 12, he says, I took care of the poor. Verse 13, somebody was about ready to die, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. In other words, I cared for people. So Job is going to begin defending himself, and he is going to begin explaining how life was good and how he helped people. Verse 16, I was a father to the poor. Verse 17, I broke the jaws of the wicked. And so he's saying, not only was life good, but I did well, I did right, I was a good man, I was a righteous man, I was fair, I did all of those things. Basically, Job is telling us in chapter 29 what it said of Job in chapter 1 and verse 1. It says that he was an upright and perfect man. Job was a very godly man and a very successful man. And so in chapter 29, to summarize it there in your notes, he's saying life was good. Life was good both from a substance standpoint, both from a relational standpoint. When he would go into town, there would be the city gates as he would go into town, or we would say it like going to the city county building. You know, he'd walk up there and there'd be officials, and when Job arrived, people would be like, hey, here comes Job. What does Job have to say? What wisdom does he have to give? And he had this respect that when Job walked in, people stood up to show honor to him. So he was a very high and reputable, not feared in the sense of a fear of, oh no, fear and trepidation, but in awe of him because of who he was. So life was good, and you couldn't have had a better life. But then we get into chapter 30. But now they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yet whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom there is old age was perished. For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness. In former times desolate and waste, who cut up mallows by the bushes and junipers for their meat. In other words, they were looking hard to find food. Verse 12, upon my right hand rise the youth, they push away my feet, and they raise up against me the ways of their destruction. They mar my path. They set forth my calamity. So no longer does he have respect amongst the elderly and the youth. The youth are making fun of him. They're mocking him. They're seeing if they can knock him down. There's no respect for Job now. Verse 20, I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and you don't regard me. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind, and causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. For I know that thou wilt bring me death into the house appointed for all living. He's like, I know I'm going to die, and Verse 24, howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Did I not weep for those that were in trouble? Was my soul not grieved for the poor? When I looked for good, then evil came upon me. And I waited for the light, there came darkness. You got up this morning hoping for light, and there was darkness. In other words, to summarize chapter 30 in this way, Job's world is turned totally upside down. He summarized his life of good in chapter 29. Chapter 30, he's saying, Lord, this is what my life is like now. We had a good relationship in chapter 29. I don't even know where you got it. And God is like, you have your hand turned against me. So his world is turned upside down. Chapter 31. Job begins to ask his question. He says, first of all, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? In other words, he's saying, I'm above reproach. Verse 2, for what portion of God is there from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? In other words, he's saying, aren't bad days for the bad people. That's what he's saying. Verse 4, do you not see my ways and count all my steps? And then he's dialoguing with God. So there for your notes, chapter 31 summarizes it this way. What did I do to deserve this? What did I do to deserve this? In verse 3, he says, disasters for the evil. And we're going to bounce through rather quickly into chapter 31, and we're going to see Job's arguments. He's talking to God, by the way. Verse 7, if my step had turned out of the way, and my heart walked after mine eyes, and if any blot had cleaved to my hands, in other words, if I did something wrong, verse 8, then let me sow and let another eat, and let my offspring be rooted out. God, if I did wrong, verse 7, if I did those things in verse 7, then the outcome should be verse 8. Life goes bad. Verse 9, if my heart had been deceived by a woman, or if I laid at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind unto another, and let others bow down unto her. For this is a heinous crime. So he's saying, if I was unfaithful, if I was deceptive, if I was lustful, and I was out to get my neighbor, then then take my wife, make her someone that's grinding wheat, all of that. He said, I don't deserve a blessing. Verse 21, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless, when I saw my help in the gate, then let my arm fall from me. He's saying, if there was somebody who had a need and I didn't care, then Lord, then let my arm fall off. Let my arm be broken from my bone. In other words, God, I don't deserve any favor from you. Verse 24, if I made gold my hope, or have set a fine gold, you're my confidence. If I rejoiced in my wealth, and he was wealthy, right? If I rejoiced in my wealth, which was great, and because mine eye had gotten much, if I beheld the sun when it shined, and the moon in its brightness, in other words, I worshiped the sun and this moon, if I did those things, and my heart was secretly enticed, verse 28, or my mouth kissed my hand, in other words, good job, guy. Did it myself. Ooh, kiss me. He said, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, and I would have denied the God that is above. In other words, he's saying what? If I did that, I deserve the consequences. But what is Job saying? I didn't do it. In each one of these, Job is saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. Verse 31. If the men of my tabernacle said not, oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened the doors to the traveler. He's saying, if I wasn't hospitable. Verse 33, if I covered my transgressions as Adam, and hiding iniquity was in my bosom. In other words, he said, if I kept silent about my sin. And he's saying, I didn't do that. Did I fear a great multitude? Did the contempt, verse 34, did the contempt of families terrify me that I kept silent and went not out of the door? So in other words, these things aren't true of me. So Job is saying, what did I do wrong to deserve this? That's what he's saying. God, look at my record. he wasn't saying that he was sinless, but in the way that he lived his life, his fear of God, how he was, the man that he was. He was a man of integrity, a man of respect. He had wealth. God had blessed him. And Job was faithful to God. And so Job is presenting the argument, God, what did I do to deserve this? That's his question. So God, if I was wrong, if I was corrupt, if I was deceptive, if I was all of these things, then God, I get it. But God, I can't find anything. I can't connect. Here's what I did, and this is why it's happening. Verse 35. Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that my adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps as a prince would. I would go near unto him. Job is saying, I'm going to defend myself before God. That's what he's saying. I'm going to defend myself. Verse 38. If my land cry against me, or that the furrows likewise thereof complain, if I have eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life, he's saying, if I did these wrong things, then verse 40, I deserve it. Verse 40, let the thistles grow instead of wheat, the cockle instead of barley. So in other words, if I truly did injustice, and the ground cries out against me because I mistreat even the ground, and I take advantage of the ground, then let the thistles grow instead of wheat, and the cockle instead of barley. He said, though, you know what, I deserve it. Chapter 32, verse 1. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was, here we go, righteous in his own eyes. Job is saying, I didn't do anything to deserve this, and I can prove it. That's what Job is saying in chapter 32. Let's fast forward. There's some dialogue that happens with another man. There was the first three. Then there was another one, Elihu, that comes along and has some interaction with Job. But we're going to go over to chapter 38. Chapter 38. It says in verse 1, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Here we go, verse 3, Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and you give me an answer. Go over to chapter 40. So God then goes into a dialogue, or excuse me, not a dialogue, he speaks to Job. Now over to chapter 40. So for the next 2 chapters, God speaks to Job, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. God continues. Chapter 40, verse 1, Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? In other words, Job, what is there that you can teach me that I do not already know? Verse 7, Gird up thy loins now like a man, I will demand of thee, and declare unto me. In other words, Job, you ask questions, let's have a conversation. So you asked all those questions, now let's talk. Gird up your loins like a man, and God's going to ask him questions and ask Job to answer. So what does God talk to him about? So he's going to take the test. Chapter 38, go back to chapter 38 and verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. So Job, when the earth was created, were you there? Go ahead and tell me about it, Job, since you were there, since you know everything. Go ahead and tell me what you know. Any enlightenment, any insight? That's what he says in verse 4. So where were you at the beginning, verses 4 through 7? Verse 8. Can you control the ocean? Who shut up the sea with its doors? Who set the boundaries for the ocean? You all like to go to the ocean. Many of you go to the ocean on your vacations. When you go to the ocean, what do you expect to happen? For the water to stay where it is. Why does that happen? Because God did that. Can you change that? Have any of you tried to change the boundaries of the sea, the ocean? You try to dig a little hole and build a little sandcastle. You can't do nothing. You can't move the boundaries of the ocean. So God asked him, what about the ocean? In verses 12 through 41, if you were to read through that, and I encourage you to do so, the summary of that is, can you control nature and the weather? So April 12th, we're going to have the egg hunt. What are we going to do? We're going to pray and ask God to give us what? Good weather. Now, what is our problem? We can't, it never happens. That is part of the problem. But the reason that it never happens is because what? We can't control it. Who can? God does. So why do we pray? Because God can control it. So God is asking him, okay, can you control the weather? Verse 30, or chapter 39, all of chapter 39, we won't take it. But if you go through chapter 9, here's what I will challenge you to do. Go through chapter 9 and highlight every animal that's mentioned in chapter 39. And there is several animals that God will list, and he'll ask Job question about every one of those animals. Some of you, the only animal you know is a dog or a cat. Some of you don't have any animals at all and don't know anything about any animals. And God's saying, okay, I'm going to list you all these animals. I'm going to list things about them. Tell me what you know, and can you take care of them? And obviously the answer is no to every one of those. In chapter 40, verses 8 to 14, God says, can you humble the wicked? Can you humble the wicked? So in chapter 40, he's saying, can you judge? Can you punish? Can you humble the wicked? Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been able to make somebody humble? I mean, you can humiliate them. I'm not asking that. So when your child is rebelling and they're very arrogant. So met a man this last week, and he said, my name's Gator. And he said, you got the name Gator? You want to know why? Because I'm all mouth and no ears. In other words, he liked to talk but didn't like to listen. And you know, it caused a problem in some relationships. And parents, can you, when your kids are mouthing off to you, when they're being disrespectful, can you humble them? Not humiliate them, not throw them down, but can you cause them to be like, oh, this is a wrong attitude. I need to be humble. I need to be respectful. No, you hope for them to do that, but you can't make them do that. You know what? God can. And then he says, can you control the mouths, the mammoth dragons, chapter 40, verse 15 through chapter 41. And the answer to all of those is this. God asked Job this question, where were you and can you? Where were you when the earth started? Were you there at the beginning? And can you control all of these animals? Can you control the weather? Can you control the ocean? Can you make the proud humble? Can you handle this mammoth dragon that's mentioned, Leviathan that's mentioned in Job chapter 40? And the answer is no, 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 no. So what is Job's conclusion after God asked him all of those questions? Turn over to chapter 42. Chapter 42 and verse 1, Job says, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withheld from you. Another way of saying that is, I know you can do everything, you can do all things, and whatever you set out to do, nobody can change that. So how would we say it this way? Job realizes that God is the one who's in complete control. God is in control. That's the conclusion after 4 chapters of conversation. Well, listening. Job asked a question. Another time he said, I'm just going to shut up and keep listening. So Job comes to the conclusion that God is in control. Verse 3. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered that I understood not. Things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. What is Job saying? I spoke of things I didn't understand, and there are a lot of things that are wonderful that I don't know. So what is he saying? There is so much I don't know. There is so much that I do not know. Verse 5. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. In other words, with my ears I heard you, but now the connections are being made. And he says, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. How would we summarize that? Is that he could see that God was in his circumstances. So in other words, you and I need to see God is in my circumstances. It doesn't mean we understand. It doesn't mean that God explains. But we know that God is in our circumstance. Because if he can control all of those things and do all of those things, and he has all wisdom and all knowledge, we don't understand, but we have to trust. And Job is saying, I need to see God is in my circumstances. So what are some things that we know about God, just in brief? We know that God can only do good. In Jeremiah 29, we know verse 11, I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. But verse 10 says that after 70 years are accomplished in Babylonian captivity, I will perform my good word towards you. So God put the Judah into exile for 70 years, and he's going to bring him back. And he said, I'm going to bring good, but right now you're under discipline. And he said, I know what my plan is. It involved discipline, but it's going to involve restoration. God says, that's my plan. Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. So it doesn't say that you won't go through the water, you won't go through the river, you won't go through the fire. It just says you won't drown and you won't get burnt up. So we know that God can only do good. Secondly, we know that God holds us. Isaiah 41:10, fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. I will help thee. I will help thee. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. With all that was going on in Job's life, God had a hold of him. God was helping him. God had his right arm around him and was holding him up. So God holds us. Psalm 56:8, you tell of my wanderings, put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in thy book? When we weep and we shed tears, God collects our tears. God collects our tears. He knows when we're hurting. He knows when we are struggling. And then 1 Peter 5:7, you need to change that in your notes. It says 5:8. That should be 1 Peter 5:7. It says, verse 6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he what? He cares for you. All that Job went through, we understand the questions because God's a good God. We understand the questions because he couldn't see any correlation between God, I was doing this, and I get why this is happening. He's like, God, I was living upright. I was living before you. And God, I don't understand why all this tragedy and turmoil has happened in my life. But he had to see God in his circumstances and to remember who his God was. We listed 4. There are so many more. But we have to trust God when life is not making sense. We have to see God in our circumstances, remembering that he is good, remembering he holds us, he captures our tears, and he cares. So where is the Lord when life hurts? He's right there, fully in the mix of it, fully caring about you, fully caring about me. And he knows and he understands. But if we want to ask God questions, God doesn't explain our circumstances. He says, remember who I am. Not in a hostile way, not in a harsh way, but in a very straightforward way. And then Job says at the end, God, I just got to trust you. I've just got to trust you because it's not making sense to me, but I know you're a good God and I know that you're in control. So God, I trust you. So where is God when life hurts? He's there. We have to simply trust. May God help us to do that. Let's stand together. Gary, would you close us in prayer this morning, please?
You weren't there causing it, so we can rely on